Hi everyone, I'm Sarah, and what I'm about to share with you will probably sound like something out of a movie, but I swear to you, every single word of this story is true. 3 months ago, my life was completely ordinary. I was a 28-year-old marketing coordinator living in a cramped studio apartment in Southeast Portland, struggling with student loans, and honestly, I felt pretty lost. I had no idea that a single piece of paper hidden in my grandmother's attic would completely change everything I thought I knew about my family, my past, and most importantly, my future. My grandmother Eleanor passed away last September. She was 89, and honestly, we all saw it coming. She'd been in declining health for months, but you know how it is. You're never really prepared for that phone call. I remember getting the news while I was at work, sitting in my gray cubicle under those horrible fluorescent lights that made everyone look like zombies. My mom's voice was shaking when she told me, and I just sat there staring at my computer screen, watching the cursor blink on a half-finished email about some promotional campaign for organic dog treats. It felt surreal. How can life just stop for someone while the rest of the world keeps spinning? The funeral was small. Grandma Eleanor had outlived most of her friends, and our family isn't exactly huge. It was me, my parents, my younger brother Jake, and maybe a dozen neighbors and people from her church. The service was held at St. Mary's Catholic Church on Division Street, the same church where she'd been going for over 40 years. I remember sitting in those uncomfortable wooden pews, listening to Father Martinez talk about her devoted service to the community and her unwavering faith. But honestly, I realized I didn't know much about my grandmother beyond the cookies she used to bake and the way she always smelled like lavender and old books. That's the thing about family, isn't it? You assume you know people because you've been around them your whole life, but sometimes the people closest to you are the ones hiding the biggest secrets. After the funeral, we all went back to Grandma's house in the Hawthorne district. It's this beautiful 1920s craftsman with a wraparound porch and these amazing original hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places. I'd spent countless childhood afternoons in that house, but walking through it after the funeral felt different, empty, like the house itself was mourning. My parents immediately started talking about selling it. "It's too much house for any of us to maintain," my dad kept saying, while my mom worried about property taxes and upkeep costs. Jake, who's always been the practical one in the family, was already looking up real estate prices on his phone. "Do you know what houses in this neighborhood are going for?" he said, showing us his screen. "We could all pay off our student loans with what this place would sell for." But something about the idea of selling Grandma's house just felt wrong to me. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light was streaming through her lace curtains, or how her reading chair still had the indent where she used to sit every morning with her coffee and crossword puzzle. I don't know, but I felt like we were being too hasty. "What if we waited a few months?" I suggested. "You know, give ourselves time to go through her things properly, make sure we're not missing anything important." My parents exchanged one of those looks that married couples do when they're having an entire conversation without words. Finally, my mom sighed. "Sarah, honey, I understand you're sentimental about the house, but we can't afford to just let it sit empty. The utilities alone." "I could stay here?" I heard myself saying before I'd even fully formed the thought. "I mean, temporarily. Just until we figure everything out. It would save me money on rent, and someone should be here to keep an eye on the place." Looking back, I think some part of me already sensed that there were secrets in that house. Not consciously, but you know that feeling when you walk into a room and something just feels off? Like there's something you're not seeing, even though you can't put your finger on what it is? My parents weren't thrilled with the idea at first, but after some discussion, they agreed to let me stay in the house for a few months while we sorted through Grandma Eleanor's belongings and figured out what to do with the property. Jake thought I was being impractical, but he also seemed relieved that he wouldn't have to deal with the emotional work of going through decades of accumulated memories. So 2 weeks after the funeral, I moved out of my studio apartment and into my grandmother's house. The first few nights were honestly pretty eerie. The house made all kinds of sounds I wasn't used to. The old radiators clanging, floorboards settling, the way the wind whistled through the eaves. I kept waking up thinking I heard footsteps, only to realize it was just the house being a house. But during the day, going through Grandma's things became almost therapeutic. I started with the easier stuff: clothes, books, kitchen items. I found myself learning things about her I'd never known. Like, did you know she had a collection of jazz records from the 1940s and 50s? I found them in her bedroom closet, carefully stored in their original sleeves. Miles Davis, Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington, music I'd never heard her listen to, but apparently she'd loved. I also found her journals, not detailed diary entries, but little notebooks where she'd jot down thoughts, grocery lists, reminders. Reading them felt intimate, like I was getting glimpses into the mundane moments of her daily life. Remember to call Mrs. Patterson about the church bake sale. That new cashier at Safeway has such kind eyes. The roses are blooming beautifully this year. Eleanor would have loved them. Wait, Eleanor would have loved them? But Grandma's name was Eleanor. Why was she writing about herself in the third person? I stared at that entry for a long time, but eventually convinced myself it was probably just a mistake. Or maybe she was thinking about someone else named Eleanor. Old people sometimes get confused, right? I tucked the journal back in the drawer and tried not to think about it. The attic was the last place I planned to tackle, mainly because I hate attics. They're always dusty and cramped and full of spiders, and this one was no exception. I kept putting it off until finally, about 6 weeks after moving in, I ran out of excuses. It was a Saturday morning in late October, and Portland was doing that thing where it can't decide if it wants to rain or shine, so the light kept changing from bright to gray and back again. I hauled the stepladder from the garage and climbed up into the attic access in the hallway ceiling. The smell hit me immediately, that mixture of dust, old wood, and something else I couldn't identify. Something that reminded me of my childhood, but I couldn't place what. The attic wasn't huge, but it was packed. Boxes and boxes of stuff, most of them unmarked. Christmas decorations, old furniture, clothes that looked like they were from the 1960s. I started near the ladder and worked my way toward the back, where the roof sloped down low. That's where I found the trunk. It was pushed way back in the corner, almost hidden behind a stack of hat boxes. It was one of those old-fashioned travel trunks, dark wood with metal reinforcement strips and a heavy brass lock. The kind of thing you see in movies about people taking steamships to Europe. I had to crawl on my hands and knees to reach it, getting cobwebs in my hair and dust all over my clothes. The trunk was heavier than I expected, but I managed to drag it out into the center of the attic where I could get a better look at it. There was no key, but the lock was old and corroded, and after some gentle persuasion with a screwdriver I'd brought up with me, it finally gave way with a satisfying click. Inside, the trunk was divided into several compartments, all lined with what looked like silk that had faded to a pale yellow. There were photographs, dozens of them, some in albums, some loose. Old clothes wrapped in tissue paper, a jewelry box with a few simple pieces, nothing valuable looking, but clearly cherished. And at the very bottom, in a manila envelope that was thick with age and handling, was a stack of letters tied together with a blue ribbon. I untied the ribbon carefully. It was so old it felt like it might crumble in my hands, and pulled out the top letter. The envelope was addressed in elegant handwriting to "My dearest Eleanor." But there was no return address, and the postmark was too faded to read clearly. I could make out what looked like 1943, but I wasn't sure. I opened the envelope carefully and pulled out several pages of writing paper. The handwriting was the same elegant script as on the envelope, and it started with, "My darling Eleanor, How I long for the day when we can be together without secrecy, without shame. My heart started beating faster. This was clearly a love letter, but from whom? Grandpa Harold had died when I was 12, and I remembered him as a sweet, but not particularly romantic man. This letter was passionate, in a way that seemed, ungrandparent-like. I read further. The nights are the hardest, knowing you're so close but that I cannot hold you. I understand why we must be careful. Society is not ready for love like ours, but my heart aches with the weight of our secret. I count the days until we can leave this place and start fresh somewhere new, where we can be ourselves without judgment. I sat back on my heels, confused. What did that mean? Society is not ready for love like ours. And who was this letter from? I flipped to the last page and found a signature. All my love, always and forever, Rose. Rose, a woman's name. I stared at that signature for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Rose. My grandmother had been receiving love letters from someone named Rose in 1943, but that would mean... With shaking hands, I untied the rest of the letters. There were 12 of them, all from Rose to Eleanor, spanning what looked like about 2 years based on the postmarks I could make out. As I read through them, a story began to emerge. Rose and Eleanor had met in Seattle, where they were both working during World War II. Eleanor in a munitions factory, Rose as a nurse at a military hospital. They'd fallen in love, but in 1943, a relationship between two women was not just socially unacceptable, it was dangerous. The letters told the story of a secret romance conducted in stolen moments and hidden glances. Rose wrote about their plans to move to California together after the war, where they could live quietly as roommates and build a life together. She wrote about her dreams of a little house with a garden where Eleanor could grow her beloved roses. And suddenly I understood why my grandmother had always been so passionate about her rose garden. But the letters stopped abruptly in 1945. The last one was different from the others, shorter, more formal. Rose was writing to say goodbye. She'd met someone else, a man, and she was getting married. She was sorry, but it was time for both of them to move on and live normal lives. I sat in that dusty attic, surrounded by the detritus of my grandmother's long life, and realized that everything I thought I knew about her was wrong. Eleanor hadn't married my grandfather Harold because she'd fallen madly in love with him. She'd married him because it was what she was supposed to do, because Rose had broken her heart and left her with no choice but to build a conventional life from the pieces. But there was more in the envelope. At the very bottom, underneath all of Rose's letters, was a single sheet of paper in my grandmother's handwriting. It was dated just 3 months before she died, and it was addressed to me. "My dearest Sarah," it began, and my hands started shaking again, as I realized she'd written this specifically for me to find. The letter was short, but every word hit me like a physical blow. "If you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have found my greatest secret. I have watched you struggle these past few years, watched you try to force yourself into a life that doesn't fit. And I see so much of my younger self in you. I want you to know that the love I shared with Rose was the truest, most beautiful thing I ever experienced, even though I was never brave enough to fight for it. I chose safety over authenticity, and while I don't regret the life I built, it gave me your wonderful father, and eventually you. I have always wondered what might have been. There is something else you need to know, something that might help you understand yourself better. Rose didn't just disappear from my life completely. We stayed in touch secretly through letters. She moved to San Francisco after her marriage, and we wrote to each other for over 40 years. She never had children, and when her husband died in 1987, she wrote to tell me that she had never stopped loving me, never stopped regretting her choice, to leave. She died in 2003, but she left something for you, for our family. The address is 1847 Castro Street, San Francisco. Ask for Margaret Chen at the law office. Tell her you're Eleanor Morrison's granddaughter. My darling girl, I hope you will be braver than I was. Life is too short to spend it pretending to be someone you're not. All my love, Grandma Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Then I sat there in the attic, crying harder than I had since I was a child, surrounded by the evidence of a love story that had been hidden for over 70 years. My grandmother had been gay, or at least she'd been in love with a woman. And somehow she'd known that I was struggling with my own identity in ways I'd barely admitted to myself. The next few days passed in a blur. I kept reading and rereading that letter, trying to process what it meant. Not just about my grandmother, but about me. How had she known? I'd barely figured it out myself. This vague feeling of disconnect, like I was playing a role in my own life instead of actually living it. I'd had crushes on boys in high school and college, sure, but they always felt performative somehow, like I was following a script rather than feeling genuine attraction. And there had been those moments, a female professor in college who made my heart race in a way I didn't understand. A coworker at my last job whose laugh made me feel warm and nervous and confused all at once. But I'd always pushed those feelings aside, told myself I was just admiring them, or that it was normal to appreciate other women's beauty. Now, sitting in my grandmother's house with her secret laid bare in front of me, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Those feelings hadn't been admiration. They'd been attraction. And maybe, just maybe, Grandma Eleanor had recognized something in me that I'd been too scared to acknowledge. I called in sick to work on Monday. I knew I should probably talk to my parents about what I'd found, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Instead, I spent the day researching. I looked up the address Grandma had given me, 1847 Castro Street in San Francisco. It was indeed a law office. Chen and Associates, specializing in estate planning and LGBT legal issues. Margaret Chen's bio on the firm's website said she'd been practicing law for over 30 years and had been a pioneer in advocating for same-sex couples' rights long before marriage equality became the law of the land. There was a photo of her, a small, severe-looking Asian woman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I must have picked up the phone to call a dozen times before I finally worked up the courage to dial the number. The receptionist put me on hold, and I waited, my palms sweating and my heart pounding like I was about to take a final exam I hadn't studied for. "This is Margaret Chen," came a crisp, professional voice. "Hi, Ms. Chen. My name is Sarah Morrison, and This is going to sound strange, but my grandmother, Eleanor Morrison, told me to contact you. She passed away a few months ago, and I found a letter." There was a long pause, and then Ms. Chen's voice softened considerably. "Sarah, yes, I've been waiting for your call. Could you come to San Francisco? There are some things I need to discuss with you in person." Yes, I suppose I could. When? This week, if possible. Are you free Thursday? I took Thursday and Friday off work. My boss wasn't happy about the short notice, but I was past caring about his approval. I'd been feeling increasingly disconnected from my job anyway, going through the motions of creating marketing campaigns for products I didn't care about, working for a company whose values didn't align with mine. The drive from Portland to San Francisco took about 10 hours. I left early Thursday morning, stopping only for gas and coffee, my mind racing the entire time. What was waiting for me in San Francisco? What had Rose left for me? And why was I so nervous about meeting with a lawyer? The Castro district was unlike anywhere I'd ever been. Rainbow flags hung from storefronts and apartment buildings, and there was an energy in the air that felt both festive and defiant. I found parking a few blocks from the law office and walked slowly down Castro Street, taking in the sights. This was where Rose had lived after leaving my grandmother. This was where she'd built her life after choosing safety over love. Chen and associates occupied the second floor of a Victorian building that had been converted to offices. Margaret Chen met me in the reception area. She was smaller than I'd expected, probably in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and those same kind eyes I'd noticed in her website photo. "Sarah," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be confusing for you." She led me into her office, which was warm and cluttered in a way that suggested decades of important work. The walls were covered with photographs. Couples at commitment ceremonies that must have taken place long before same-sex marriage was legal. Protest marches. Celebrations. A lifetime of fighting for people's right to love who they loved. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," Ms. Chen began, gesturing for me to sit in one of the comfortable chairs across from her desk. I never met her personally, but Rose spoke of her often. Rose Wellington was one of my first clients, back in the early 1980s. "Wellington," I repeated. "That was Rose's married name?" "Yes. She married Thomas Wellington in 1945, shortly after she broke things off with your grandmother. It was a different time, Sarah. The pressure to conform, to hide who you were, was enormous. Rose made a practical choice, but it haunted her for the rest of her life." Ms. Chen opened a thick file folder on her desk. "Rose came to me in 1982 because she wanted to make arrangements. She'd been corresponding with your grandmother for decades. They never saw each other again after the war, but they maintained a friendship through letters. When Rose's husband died in 1987, she seriously considered reaching out to Eleanor directly, maybe even visiting Portland. Why didn't she? Fear, mostly, and respect for the life Eleanor had built. Your grandmother was married, had a family. Rose didn't want to complicate that. But she also wanted to make sure that if anything happened to her, Eleanor would know that their love had mattered, that it had shaped her entire life." Ms. Chen pulled a document from the file. "Rose died in 2003, as your grandmother mentioned in her letter. She left her entire estate to Eleanor, but with specific instructions that Eleanor was to use the inheritance as she saw fit, whether for herself or to pass on to her family. The amount has been sitting in a trust account, gaining interest, for over 20 years now." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "How much money are we talking about?" Ms. Chen named a figure that made me dizzy. It wasn't millionaire money, but it was enough to change someone's life completely. Enough to pay off student loans, buy a house, start a business, or just have the freedom to make choices based on what you wanted rather than what you could afford. "Rose was very clear about her intentions," Ms. Chen continued. "She wanted this money to give someone in Eleanor's family the freedom to live authentically, to make brave choices. She hoped it might help someone avoid the regrets she and Eleanor had lived with." I stared at the paperwork Ms. Chen had placed in front of me, but the numbers seemed to swim on the page. "I don't understand. Why me specifically? Why not my parents or my brother?" Ms. Chen smiled. "Eleanor wrote to Rose about all of you over the years. From what Rose told me, your grandmother suspected that you might face some of the same challenges they had faced. She wanted to make sure you had options they never had." The weight of what she was saying settled over me slowly. My grandmother hadn't just left me money. She'd left me a choice. The choice to be honest about who I was, even if it meant disappointing people or going against expectations. The choice to be brave. "There's one more thing," Ms. Chen said, pulling an envelope from the file. "Rose left a letter for Eleanor's family. She wrote it shortly before she died." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and began to read. "To Eleanor's family, I pray that by the time you read this, the world has become a kinder, more accepting place than it was in my youth. Eleanor and I were not able to live openly as the people we truly were, but our love was real and beautiful and worthy of celebration. I have lived my entire adult life with the regret of not being brave enough to fight for that love. And I have watched from afar as Eleanor built a wonderful family, despite the sadness I caused her. This inheritance is my attempt to give someone in her family what we never had, the freedom to choose love over fear, authenticity over safety. Use this gift wisely and know that you carry with you the hopes and dreams of two women who loved each other across decades and distance. With love and hope for your happiness, Rose Wellington. I was crying by the time I finished reading, and Ms. Chen quietly pushed a box of tissues across her desk. We sat in silence for several minutes while I tried to process everything I'd learned. "What happens now?" I finally asked. "That's up to you," Ms. Chen replied. "The money is yours. Your grandmother made that clear in her own will. You can do whatever you want with it. But I think the real question is, what do you want to do with your life?" I left Ms. Chen's office with a head full of questions and a heart full of emotions I couldn't name. I walked around the Castro district for hours, stopping in bookstores and cafes, watching couples walk hand in hand down the sidewalk. For the first time in my life, I let myself really look at women, not just glance and look away, but actually see them. And I felt something I'd never allowed myself to feel before: genuine attraction, and the possibility that I might not have to hide from it forever. That night, in my hotel room, overlooking the bay, I called my best friend from college, Maya. We'd stayed close over the years, and she was one of the few people I felt like I could be completely honest with. "Maya," I said when she answered, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen, okay?" And for the first time in my life, I said the words out loud. "I think I might be gay." Maya's response was not what I expected. After a long pause, she started laughing, not in a mean way, but like she was relieved. "Sarah," she said, "I have been waiting for you to figure that out for literally 10 years. "What do you mean?" "Honey, do you remember junior year when you had that massive crush on Professor Williams? The one you insisted was just academic admiration? Or when we went to that party at Jessica's and you spent the entire night talking to her roommate about poetry, and then couldn't stop talking about her for weeks afterward?" I felt heat rise in my face, even though Maya couldn't see me. I was just, "Sarah, you've never once described a guy the way you described Professor Williams or Jessica's roommate. I've been your friend for a decade, and I've watched you go through the motions of dating men, but you never light up when you talk about them. You light up when you talk about women, even though you always find ways to explain it away." I sat on the hotel bed, staring out at the lights of San Francisco, and realized that Maya was right. How many people in my life had been waiting for me to figure out what they already knew? "I'm scared," I admitted. "Of course you are. This is scary. But Sarah, you've been miserable for years, and I think this is why. You've been trying to force yourself into a life that doesn't fit. Maybe it's time to try living as yourself, instead of as who you think you're supposed to be." We talked for 2 more hours. Maya told me about her own journey of self-discovery. She'd come out as bisexual in college, something I'd somehow managed to not fully process at the time, probably because I wasn't ready to think about what it might mean for me. She gave me the names of some books to read, some podcasts to listen to, some online communities where I could connect with other people who were figuring things out. Most importantly, she reminded me that I didn't have to figure everything out at once. "This is a process," she said. "You don't have to come out to your family tomorrow or quit your job or completely reinvent yourself overnight. Take it one step at a time." I drove back to Portland the next day with my mind churning. The inheritance meant I had options I'd never had before. I could quit the job that was making me miserable. I could travel. I could go back to school. I could even move somewhere new and start fresh. But first, I needed to figure out who I actually was, underneath all the layers of expectation and fear I'd built up over the years. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research and self-reflection in a way I never had before. I read everything I could get my hands on about LGBTQ plus identity, coming out, and building authentic relationships. I joined online forums where people shared their stories, and I was amazed by how many of them echoed my own experience. Years of feeling disconnected, of going through the motions of heterosexual dating while never feeling fully engaged or satisfied. I also started thinking seriously about my career. My job in marketing had always felt like a placeholder, something I'd fallen into after college because I needed to pay bills, not because I was passionate about it. With the inheritance, I had the freedom to consider what I actually wanted to do with my life. I'd always loved writing, but I'd never pursued it seriously because it seemed impractical, too risky. Now, suddenly, I could afford to take risks. I started writing again. First, just journaling about my experiences and feelings, then branching out into creative writing. Stories about family secrets, about women discovering hidden parts of themselves, about the courage it takes to live authentically in a world that often pressures you to conform. But the hardest part was figuring out how to tell my family. I knew they loved me and wanted me to be happy, but I also knew they had expectations. My mom had been not so subtly asking about my dating life for years, clearly hoping I'd settle down with a nice man and give her grandchildren. My dad was traditional in a lot of ways, and while he wasn't bigoted, he also wasn't particularly progressive when it came to LGBTQ plus issues. And Jake? Well, Jake and I had always had a complicated relationship, and I wasn't sure how he'd react to this news. The decision was made for me in early December, about 6 weeks after my trip to San Francisco. I was having dinner with my parents at their house in Beaverton, and my mom was going through her usual routine of asking if I was dating anyone. "You know, Sarah, the Parker's son just moved back to Portland from grad school," she said, passing me the mashed potatoes. "He's a very nice young man, and he's single. I could introduce you." Something in me just snapped. Maybe it was the weeks of reading about authenticity and courage, or maybe it was the weight of my grandmother's story and Rose's letter, but I couldn't pretend anymore. "Mom," I said, setting down my fork, "I need to tell you something. I'm gay." The silence that followed was deafening. My parents both froze, and I could see them trying to process what I'd just said. Finally, my dad cleared his throat. Are you sure?" he asked, and I could tell he was trying to be supportive, but didn't really know how. "Yes, Dad, I'm sure. I've probably known for a long time, but I was too scared to admit it to myself, let alone to you guys." My mom's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I was terrified that she was disappointed or upset. But then she reached across the table and took my hand. "Honey," she said, "I just want you to be happy. If this is who you are, then we love and support you completely." My dad nodded emphatically. "Of course we do. You're our daughter, and nothing could ever change how much we love you." I started crying then, not from sadness, but from relief. I'd been so afraid of disappointing them, but they were handling it better than I dared to hope. "There's something else," I said, and then I told them about Grandma Eleanor's letter, about Rose, about the inheritance, about everything I'd learned over the past few months. My parents were shocked, but in a different way than they'd been about my coming out. They'd known Eleanor their entire married life, and my dad had grown up with her as his mother, but they'd never suspected she'd harbored such a significant secret. "She never said anything," my dad kept repeating. "All those years, and she never said anything." "She couldn't," I explained. "It was a different time. She didn't have the option to be open about who she was." We talked late into the night. My parents asked questions, some awkward but all well-intentioned, and I tried to answer as honestly as I could. They were curious about the inheritance, of course, but they were more concerned about making sure I knew they supported me. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," my mom said as I was getting ready to leave. "If she saw something in you that made her think you needed this kind of support, then I'm glad she made sure you got it." Telling Jake was harder. When I called him a few days later, his first reaction was skepticism. "Are you sure you're not just going through some kind of phase?" he asked. "I mean, you dated guys in college. What was his name? That business major you were with for like 6 months?" "Trevor," I said. "And yes, I dated him, but it never felt right. It never felt real." "Look, I understand this is surprising, but I've given this a lot of thought. This isn't a phase." Jake was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Okay, I don't pretend to understand it, but if you're happy, then I'm happy for you. Just be careful, okay? The world can be pretty cruel to people who are different." It wasn't the most enthusiastic response, but it wasn't rejection either. I knew Jake would need time to fully process and accept this new information about me, but at least he was trying. The hardest conversation was with myself. Even with my family's support, even with the financial freedom the inheritance provided, I still had to figure out how to actually live as a gay woman. I'd spent 28 years in the closet. I didn't know how to flirt with women, how to navigate dating, how to find community. I started small. I joined a book club for LGBTQ+ women that met at Powell's Books. I volunteered with an organization that provided support for LGBTQ+ youth. I started going to events in Portland's queer community, slowly building friendships and connections. And then, in January, I met Carmen. She was at a poetry reading at a coffee shop in the Alberta Arts District. She was the featured reader that night, and when she got up to perform, I was mesmerized. She was beautiful, tall and curvy with dark hair and expressive brown eyes, but it was more than that. She was confident and funny and passionate about her work in a way that made me feel like I was seeing what authentic self-expression looked like for the first time. After her reading, I worked up the courage to approach her and tell her how much I'd enjoyed her poetry. We ended up talking for 2 hours about writing and art and Portland and life. When she asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime, I said yes before I could lose my nerve. Our first official date was at a little cafe in Southeast Portland. I was so nervous I could barely eat. But Carmen was easy to talk to, and before I knew it, 3 hours had passed. She told me about her work as a freelance writer and poet, about her travels, about her close-knit family who'd embraced her sexuality from the beginning. I told her about my recent coming out, about my grandmother's story, about my own tentative steps toward living authentically. "That's incredibly brave," she said when I finished. "Both your grandmother, for leaving you that letter and that inheritance, and you, for having the courage to act on it." I felt something shift in my chest when she said that, a warmth and recognition I'd never experienced before. This was what attraction was supposed to feel like. This was what all those romance novels and movies had been trying to describe, but I'd never understood because I'd been looking in the wrong direction. We started seeing each other regularly. Carmen was patient with my inexperience, understanding about my nervousness, and encouraging about my writing. She introduced me to her friends, a diverse group of artists and activists and free spirits who welcomed me with open arms. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Dating women was different from dating men in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was less defined protocol, fewer social scripts to follow. I had to learn to be more direct about my feelings, more honest about what I wanted, more willing to be vulnerable. And there were practical considerations I'd never thought about. Holding hands with Carmen in public sometimes drew stares or comments. I had to learn to navigate situations where I wasn't sure if it was safe to be openly affectionate. I had to deal with friends and coworkers who made assumptions about my relationship status or asked invasive questions about my personal life. But the challenges were worth it for the way I felt when I was with Carmen. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was being completely myself with another person. I didn't have to perform or pretend or hide parts of who I was. She saw all of me, my insecurities and fears, as well as my strengths and dreams, and she loved me anyway. By spring, I knew I was in love with Carmen, and she with me. We'd been together for 4 months, and I couldn't imagine going back to the half-life I'd been living before. The inheritance from Rose had given me the financial freedom to make changes, but falling in love had given me the emotional courage to actually make them. I quit my marketing job in March. My boss was not pleased. I was leaving them short-staffed during their busy season, but I'd stopped caring about his approval months earlier. I used some of the inheritance money to pay off my student loans completely, which felt like removing a weight I'd been carrying for years. The rest I invested conservatively, keeping enough liquid to support myself while I figured out what came next. What came next was writing. I'd been working on a novel inspired by my grandmother's story, a fictionalized account of two women falling in love during World War II and the choices they faced in a society that wouldn't accept them. Carmen encouraged me to submit some chapters to literary magazines, and to my amazement, I started getting acceptances. I also began speaking at LGBTQ+ events about my experience coming out later in life. I discovered that my story resonated with a lot of people, women who'd spent years trying to fit into heterosexual relationships that never felt quite right, people who'd hidden parts of themselves out of fear or family pressure, anyone who'd ever felt like they were living someone else's life instead of their own. In May, Carmen and I decided to move in together. We found a beautiful apartment in the Pearl District with huge windows and exposed brick walls, the kind of place I'd always dreamed of living but never thought I could afford. Carmen set up a writing space for herself in the second bedroom, and I claimed a corner of the living room for my own desk. Living with Carmen was a revelation. I'd lived with roommates before, of course, but this was different. This was building a life with someone, making decisions together, creating a home that reflected both of our personalities and dreams. We adopted a rescue cat named Frida, who liked to sleep on my laptop while I was trying to write. We hosted dinner parties for our friends. We talked about the future, not in the vague, someday way I'd always approached planning before, but with specific goals and timelines, and shared dreams. In June, we drove down to San Francisco for Pride. It was my first Pride celebration, and I wasn't sure what to expect. Carmen had been going for years, but she was patient with my nervousness and excitement. Walking through the Castro district during Pride weekend was like stepping into a different world. Rainbow flags hung from every building, the streets were packed with people celebrating, and there was an energy of joy and defiance and community that took my breath away. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than myself, to be connected to a history of people who'd fought for the right to love openly and live authentically. While we were in San Francisco, I visited Margaret Chen again. I wanted to thank her for her role in helping me discover my grandmother's story, and I wanted to tell her how the inheritance had changed my life. Rose would be so pleased, Ms. Chen said when I finished updating her on everything that had happened over the past year. She always hoped that money would give someone the freedom to be brave. It sounds like that's exactly what happened. I also visited the Castro Street address where Rose had lived. The building had been converted to condos, but I stood outside for a long time, thinking about the woman who'd loved my grandmother from afar for 70 years, who'd never forgotten their brief time together during the war, who'd spent her inheritance on the hope that someone in Eleanor's family would have the courage she and my grandmother had never been able to find. That evening, Carmen and I walked through Dolores Park as the sun was setting over the city. The park was full of people, couples and families and groups of friends enjoying the warm evening. I watched two elderly women walking hand in hand, both wearing matching Pride t-shirts. And I thought about my grandmother and Rose. They should have been able to grow old together like that. They should have been able to hold hands in public, to build a life together, to love each other openly. "What are you thinking about?" Carmen asked, noticing my thoughtful mood. "My grandmother," I said, "and Rose, and how different their story might have been if they'd been born 60 years later." Carmen squeezed my hand. "But their story isn't over," she said. "It's continuing through you, through the choices you're making, the life you're building, the courage you're showing. They may not have been able to be together, but their love made your freedom possible. I started crying then, not from sadness, but from gratitude. Gratitude for my grandmother's wisdom in hiding that letter where I would find it. Gratitude for Rose's generosity in leaving an inheritance for people she'd never met. Gratitude for Carmen's love and patience. Gratitude for living in a time and place where I could be open about who I was without losing my family or my safety. We flew back to Portland the next day, but something had shifted in me during that trip. I felt more confident, more settled in my identity, more committed to living authentically no matter what challenges came up. In July, I finished the first draft of my novel. It was rough and would need significant revision, but it was complete. A full story about love and courage and the price of hiding who you are. I dedicated it to Eleanor and Rose and to all the people who'd been forced to love in secret. I also started planning something special for the anniversary of finding my grandmother's letter. It had been almost a year since that day in the attic when my entire understanding of my family and myself had been turned upside down. I wanted to mark the occasion somehow, to honor both the pain and the joy of that discovery. I decided to throw a party, not just for Carmen and me, but for my family and friends, to celebrate authenticity and love in all its forms. I invited my parents, Jake and his girlfriend Maya, and her partner, Carmen's friends, my new friends from the LGBTQ+ community, and anyone else who'd been part of my journey over the past year. The party was held in our apartment on a warm evening in late August. I'd been nervous about mixing all these different parts of my life, my family, my old friends, my new community, but everyone got along beautifully. My dad spent most of the evening talking with Carmen about her poetry, clearly making an effort to understand and appreciate the person I'd fallen in love with. My mom cried when I read excerpts from my novel, and Jake surprised me by saying he was proud of how brave I'd been. But the most meaningful moment came when I stood up to address the group. I'd prepared a short speech, but when I looked around the room at all these people who'd supported me through this transformation, the words I'd planned flew out of my head. A year ago, I began. I thought I knew who I was. I thought I understood my family, my history, my future. Then I found a letter in my grandmother's attic and everything changed. I told them about Eleanor and Rose, about the courage it had taken for my grandmother to leave me that letter, about the inheritance that had made my freedom possible. I talked about the fear I'd felt when I first realized I was gay, and the joy I discovered in living authentically. I thanked everyone in the room for their role in my journey, my family for their unconditional love, my friends for their support, Carmen for showing me what real love felt like. The most important thing I've learned this year, I concluded, is that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. My grandmother never got that chance, but she made sure I did. And I hope that by living openly and honestly, I can help create a world where other people don't have to wait until they're 28 to figure out who they are. The applause was thunderous, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Carmen came up to me afterward and whispered, "I love you, and I'm so proud of you." As I write this, it's been 15 months since I found that letter in the attic. My novel is being considered by several publishers, and I've started work on a second book, a memoir about coming out later in life and finding love in unexpected places. Carmen and I are talking about marriage, about buying a house together, about the family we might build through adoption or surrogacy. I still live in my grandmother's house sometimes, when I need quiet space to write, or when I want to feel connected to her memory. I've turned her bedroom into a writing studio, and I've restored her rose garden to its former glory. Every time I look at those roses, I think about the love she shared with Rose, about the courage it took to hide that love for 70 years, and about the generosity that led her to ensure her granddaughter wouldn't have to make the same sacrifice. The other day, I got a letter from a woman in Ohio who'd heard me speak at an LGBT LGBTQ+ conference. She was 53 years old and had just come out to her family after reading an article I'd written about my experience. "Your grandmother's story gave me courage," she wrote. "Thank you for sharing it." I realized then that Eleanor and Rose's love story wasn't just continuing through my life, it was rippling outward, touching people I'd never meet, giving them permission to be brave in their own lives. The letter I'd found in that dusty attic had changed my destiny, but it was also changing other people's destinies, creating a chain of courage and authenticity that stretched far beyond what my grandmother could have imagined when she sat down to write those words. Sometimes I wonder what Eleanor and Rose would think if they could see how their story ended, not with the sadness and regret they'd carried for so long, but with love and celebration, and the knowledge that their sacrifice had meaning. They couldn't be together, but they made it possible for people like me and Carmen to build the life they'd only dreamed of. I keep their letters in my desk drawer now, tied with that same blue ribbon. Sometimes I take them out and read them, not just to remember their story, but to remind myself of the power of love to transcend time and circumstance, to create possibilities for future generations, to change destinies in ways we might never fully understand. The last line of my grandmother's letter to me was, "Life is too short to spend it pretending to be someone you're not." It's a lesson I'm still learning every day, but it's also a lesson I'm trying to teach through my writing, my speaking, and my life. Because the truth is, we all have letters hidden in our attics, secrets and truths and authentic selves waiting to be discovered. Sometimes it takes courage to climb up into those dusty spaces and dig through the boxes of our past. But sometimes, if we're brave enough to look, we find exactly what we need to become who we're meant to be. And sometimes we find love stories that were never finished. Love stories that are still being written through us, through our choices, through our courage to live authentically in a world that doesn't always make it easy. My name is Sarah Morrison, and I found my grandmother's hidden letter in the attic. It changed my destiny, but more than that, it taught me that destiny isn't something that happens to you. It's something you create, one brave choice at a time.